Today I want to talk about the values of an experiential education. Vitalist Herbalism, for me, was entirely born out of an experiential education. Completely informal education to start, and only formalized by my own efforts in recognizing what was available to me. This is how I came to understand the idea of bioregional herbalism. Going for a walk. I've been for walks with people who knew the landscape, that had been born and raised perhaps in that landscape, or had spent a lot of time there, or knew it, had taken to it similarly to the place that they were from. And they knew things about it. They knew about the plants. They knew about some of the animals, reptiles and so forth, birds. They placed a value on these living beings of the landscape, not just as utilitarian resources, but as living life forms to relate to. And their relationship with these life forms was a part of their spiritual approach to how they worked with herbs for healing. So I want to talk about experiential learning and why that is so different from what we've been raised in conventionally, and for the most part, to receive a lesson via textbook, to be shown a sequence of pieces of information and how they build to an understanding of a concept, whether you've experienced it or not. It's a didactic approach. It's very common and also very useful for instilling a faithfulness to an order, a faithfulness or a respect for an order that you may not necessarily understand. It's just something that you're being told, and if you can repeat it properly in the correct sequence, in the correct order, with the correct understanding, then you're awarded for it. You're rewarded for it. With the experiential form of learning, we begin to tap into the fabric, the interconnected fabric of all of life. In such a circumstance, these silvery plants over my shoulder here are not just Artemisia tridentata. That's an abstract name that exists in an artificial realm. To categorize and understand these plants in a way conceptually and logistically that can be related to plants elsewhere on this continent and across the seas and other continents, and be communicated via scientific literature to other people who speak that language. But that's not the language of the plants, and it's not the language necessarily that's been spoken by the plants to the people. So to begin to understand these plants in the context of who they are by their nature and their interconnectedness with this landscape in this particular place at this particular time, in fact, is revealing the depth of potential of learning and understanding and the complexity and deep array of information available to us when we seek to experience the information. And when I say experience the information, I don't mean experience Artemisia tridentata, for example, but I mean experience the fluid dynamic of this place at this time. Here I am passing from sunny canyon side down to creekside ravine. The Artemisia tridentata is present, but stops about 15, 20 feet from the creek. That's given me some information about that plant. and it extends to the other side of the creek, absent from what now happens to be the shady green area. So in its presence and in its absence, in the context of this landscape, I'm receiving information about that plant if I have eyes to see it. That's just what my eyes perceive and my rational mind deduces. That's just the first step. Touching it and feeling its softness and smelling it is yet another layer of that. And again, it's still my 5 basic senses. I can taste it, and I can taste its bitterness with the slight, sweet pungency. Barely sweet and slightly pungent, but an overriding bitterness as I move through the taste. I'm assuming about that. That's been my experience with Artemisia tridentata, whether I've tasted it here in this location previously or not, certainly in other locations. But I can also learn by tasting this plant now in this place, as it may be different than how I've tasted it elsewhere, which is yet another layer of information coming to me. And then, of course, seeing this watercress growing in the creek behind me, seeing the stage that it's in. It's telling me about where it's at in its life cycle, perhaps what might have happened here, if anything at all. Animal foraging, floodwaters coming through, or perhaps the emergence of its season. These are all possible things to consider in this fluid dynamic of reality and nature. When I step out onto the landscape and begin to apply first my senses, and then secondarily my previous experience and the information that I've gathered, perhaps by the benefit of what other people have done in terms of the categorization of these plants by their names, whether folk taxonomy or whether scientific taxonomy, I have the benefit of inheriting that information, and I can apply it as a reference point. But that reference point, those reference points, for whatever sort of a map or a network that they may create, or be made up of, it's a static 2-dimensional framework. When I step out into the landscape, it's alive, it's fluid. Now it's incumbent upon me to be able to tap into that and to become aware of that. When we move through the landscape rapidly with our own thoughts, coming from our boxes, our concrete, asphalt, completely electrified world, we're not necessarily connecting to what's out here. We may be at some level. The odds are, in my perceptions, my experiences, it takes some time to begin, unless you're intentionally doing so. Generally, it's 3 days. 3 days of immersion in a natural landscape until the human starts to wake up and say, oh, wow, this feels different. It's the same place that you arrived in, more or less. But now, as we begin to attune to the place, and something in ourselves begins to waken up, open up, melt away, dissolve, however you look at it. Maybe it's a shroud around our heads through our intellectual mind's projection of what we think reality is, or what we need to do, what we need to see, or whatever myriad of possibilities it could be. We start to begin to see and feel. That's the state that I consider to be the 5-year-old. How does a 5-year-old relate to the world around them? A 5-year-old is often curious. Hopefully so. Hopefully they haven't had that knocked out of them by then. But usually a 5-year-old is just starting kindergarten, maybe in preschool. And so they still have that curiosity for life. For them, living is playfulness. They pick something up, they pick up a leaf. Who knows what's going on in their mind about what they're imagining when they see that, what they feel that they could create with that. They would make a dish of food. They would make a game out of it, become their currency. It's the state of mind of the 5-year-old that we seek to come back to. In my approach to Vitalist Herbalism, the exercises are related to tapping back in to that understanding within ourselves of who we are and reacquainting ourselves with those faculties such that now we can connect with the world around us, i.e. the plants, in a way that is authentic at the level of an innocent, curious, relatively naive 5-year-old would be. Not naive in the sense that they're to be fooled, but actually can't be fooled. Can't be fooled that what they see in front of them isn't what they see. How many of us have fallen prey to that by how we've been educated or what we've been told? I've heard wise people say, don't believe a thing you hear and believe only half of what you see. This ties in to one of the primary principles of Vitalist Herbalism, and that's the faculty of discernment. It's the plants themselves that have helped bring my attention to that and my awareness to the importance of discernment. And through the process of slow and steady reacquainting of our senses and our soul, what the Irish call the anam, with the landscape, we begin to relearn the language of the landscape, of the particular landscape that's around us, in a very slow and steady way. Even if it's in a language that we cannot articulate,